For those districts who use the Marzano TPEP instructional framework in the state of Washington, there are some minor revisions and updates that we want to draw your attention to for the coming school years. My name is Mark Gardner. I'm a practicing English teacher in the Camas School District, and I'm also co-lead for the Marzano TPEP instructional framework for our state. So as we talk about these updates, the first logical question is why? So brief background. The Art and Science of Teaching by Robert Marzano is meta-research that was published in 2007 and formed the basis for our current TPEP framework language. And as you might remember, if you were in the profession at the time, the changes to teacher evaluation and TPEP were brought about by legislative action in 2010. Since then, however, Marzano has continued research and has published the new Art and Science in 2017. And that includes research-based updates to terminology, practices, and particularly resources for supporting effective teaching practice. Those resources are one of the main reasons why we chose to do the updates at this time. Many districts in our state use the Marzano Compendium, which is aligned with the new Art and Science and is a resource that there's literally hundreds of pages of support documents that can be used for coaching conversations, for evaluation conversations, for helping teachers focus on growth and development. Because many districts in Washington use this resource for supporting teacher growth and development through professional growth goal setting, evaluation, or coaching conversations, or for deepening understanding of research-based practices, we decided to explore what it would take to revise or update our current TPEP frameworks. And we discovered that the changes were pretty minor, and we felt like it was something that wouldn't cause too much turmoil in districts across the state. So before we talk about the changes, what did not change? The state criteria did not change. Same big 8 that we're used to. The number and the content of the components did not change, and so therefore scoring methodology doesn't change either. The scoring rubrics themselves didn't change. There was no wording changes to any of the component scoring rubrics, so there's not a need to rebargain anything. Really, all that has changed is some of the supporting language and the vocabulary that's used to describe the practices in some places. So we've got those big 8 criteria that are used statewide. In Marzano, underneath each of those 8 criteria, we have some components that describe different specific teaching practices. And each of those is connected with a rubric. I want to reiterate one more time that there have been no changes to the language or scoring methodology for these rubrics. So that's not something that should cause too much upset for folks. As we think about the changes, many of them are just about grammar and clarity. So if we start with criteria 7 in components 7.1 and 7.2, previously the language was just kind of clunky. We just cleaned up the grammar. Engaging in positive interactions with parents and the school community about courses, programs, and school events. And engaging in timely and professional interactions with parents and the school community. No change in the substance, just clarity and consistency for parallel construction with the rest of the framework. The other place where we have some wording shifts is in components 1.4, 2.4, and 2.5. Previously, all of those components included the phrase typically underserved to describe students. Now that language is being revised to reluctant learners and students regularly marginalized or underserved by school systems. Reluctant learners is drawn from Marzano's research in the new Art and Science of Teaching, and the phrase students regularly marginalized or underserved by school systems is very intentional. Rather than labeling individual students as if there's some deficit within the student, it's really helping us realize that some students are not performing because of systems that are in place in schools. And we know that there are disparate impacts based on race, based on special education status, and other factors. And so by drawing our attention to the students who are too often marginalized or underserved by school systems, we can focus on classroom practices that help to avoid perpetuating those systemic inequities. The slightly more substantive changes occur in criteria 2 in components 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. The rubrics don't change, the descriptors of teacher behaviors don't change, but some of the terminology is just updated. Specifically, if we think about before, those 3 components represented 3 different lesson segments: getting kids to interact with new knowledge, organizing them to practice and deepen their knowledge, and organizing them for cognitive complexity. Those last 2, that phrase organizing students, was unnecessarily confusing. too many people thought that that meant you had to put students into small groups. You had to physically organize them. That wasn't the intent. So that language is being revised away. More significantly, though, 2.1, interacting with new knowledge, has been revised to conducting direct instruction lessons. Marzano points out in the New Art and Science that the phrase direct instruction has a very negative connotation at times. However, the research supports that direct instruction from a teacher to a student, where the teacher provides information directly to the student, is statistically incredibly effective, more effective than in most cases discovery learning. So direct instruction is not treating the student like a passive receptacle of the information. In fact, good direct instruction actively engages students, and that's part of what this component is focusing on. To think about direct instruction, how a teacher chunks the content into manageable pieces for students, how the teacher facilitates the students processing the content, and how the teacher gets the students to record and represent the content. That is what is meant by direct instruction lessons. We're not talking Ben Stein in Ferris Bueller here. The second level, 2.2, instead of organizing students to practice and deepen, we just clarified that language, conducting, practicing, and deepening lessons. Within conducting, practicing, and deepening lessons, using practice sessions, examining similarities and differences, looking at errors in reasoning, those are the kinds of things that we'd expect to see in that kind of a lesson. And this is not a change. This is not new. It's just renaming some of the practices. And last, instead of organizing students for cognitively complex tasks, it's now conducting knowledge application lessons. Knowledge application is inherently a cognitively complex task. And so, as the research continued to evolve, getting students to apply their knowledge in a variety of ways was simply better language for describing what the intent of 2.3 was. So if we think about those components that are highlighted here in orange, those are the only places where we're seeing any significant rewordings. There's no changes to rubrics, there's no changes to scoring methodology. It's just some cleanup of some terminology. When we think about the way our system is structured for our framework, we have our criteria, and then underneath it, we have our components. Some districts, however, go even further to a smaller grain, and that's the elements. So that is actually where more of our revisions are taking place. Since not all districts actually use elements as part of their system, if your district doesn't use elements, you can fast forward the video to the next steps. If your district does use elements, the next few slides will help clarify what that means. So as a reminder, the use of Marzano elements in teacher evaluation is not mandated by state policy, but may be required by local district policy or collective bargaining agreements. So as a reminder of where the elements fit in, we have our big criteria, like criteria 2, demonstrating effective teaching practices. And then under some components, not all, some components such as 2.6, we have multiple elements. Those are intended to be ways to look at specific teacher practices for promoting growth. These are not 10 more things that have to be scored by an evaluator. The intent here is to provide very focused language where a teacher and evaluator could have conversations or could set goals about improving discrete aspects of their practice. So the places where elements are significantly impacted, where there are new elements, are 2.3, 2.6, and 6.2. So conducting knowledge application lessons has 3 new elements. The teacher engages students in cognitively complex tasks, which require them to apply what they've learned in novel situations. The teacher provides resources and guidance to students as they engage in those cognitively complex knowledge application tasks. And the teacher engages students in opportunities to generate new conclusions, defend claims, and provide evidence to support their conclusions. These are not new concepts or new practices, they're just newly specified within our framework. And as a reminder, these elements are really about finding ways to support teacher growth if these happen to be areas that a teacher might need to work on. Within 2.6, under demonstrating teaching practices, which is about engagement, element 2.6.10 is a new one. It's about the teacher motivating and inspiring students. In the New Art and Science of Teaching, Marzano's research uncovered that the teacher's ability to connect with students and motivate them and inspire them has a direct impact on engagement. So this is not a new concept. It's not like now we've suddenly decided it's important to inspire students. It's just now reflected as a potential growth area that teachers might look at within within component 2.6. 6.2 is about using multiple data elements, and these are completely new elements to our framework, even though we've done these in practice before. Informal assessment of the whole class, which could be those kinds of things that we do as we are up in front of a group of students just to monitor our understanding of their understanding, and also formal assessments of individual students. Those could be individualized interviews or tasks that students do, or it could be me as an English teacher, for example, assigning everyone to write a paragraph. Even though they all write to the same prompt, I'm individually assessing each student's paragraph. And so these are not new practices, they're just more specifically called out as elements under 6.2 now. One of the things to recognize about our previous framework regarding elements and criteria 2 is that criteria component 2.1 had 8 elements, 2.2 had 7 elements, and 2.3 had none. And so that was kind of imbalanced in terms of the 3 kinds of lessons that are the focus of instruction. With these revisions, each of those 3 types of lessons, has 3 elements that support thinking about the way that those practices can be put into place. So that leaves 9 elements that seem to have just disappeared. They didn't simply disappear from our framework. We didn't delete them. In fact, they've been moved to an appendix, which could be kind of confusing, but keeping in mind that the research bore out that these specific elements could apply to any of the 3 lesson segments. So, for example, element 2.A.1, the A stands for appendix, the teacher previews a lesson or a part of a lesson as involving important information to which the students should pay particular attention. That can happen in any of the lesson segments, whether it's new knowledge, practicing and deepening, or knowledge application. So depending on what a teacher might be working on, the teacher and their evaluator might select one or more of these elements as goal-setting areas if you are working in a district or building where the elements are a tool. So the next logical question is the timeline. So for this current school year, 2020 through 2021, you can either, as a district, shift to the new language immediately. Hopefully you've seen that the linguistic shifts are pretty minor. We're not talking about major structural upheaval. Or if now is not a good time for that, you could work on ways to acquaint users to the new language. In the following school year, starting in 2021, the new language will be the statewide policy and is to be used in TPEP evaluations. And like I said, it's not a major shift. It's just a matter of some find and replace in some of the terms we've used in the past. Your next steps, since the shifts are small, consider ways to inform your staff. That could be sharing this video. You could provide the infographic that's available. You could encourage them, as the teachers, as they do their professional growth goal setting, to simply use the revisions as opposed to the previous year's structure. If your district does not use eval or observation, which means you use your own forms or spreadsheets or whatever, you may need to edit those local forms and documents to match the new terminology, remembering that there are not changes to the rubrics. If your district does use eval or observation, OSPI is working with those to update the platform to have the most current language and get that completed as soon as possible. So that's the overview of the shifts that are taking place in the Marzano instructional framework. My hope is that these are not seismic shifts for you, just a matter of some find and replace and just adding a new layer to the prior schema you've built about the Marzano instructional framework. If you have any questions or concerns about transition, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Office of Educator Effectiveness at OSPI.